Hi, everybody. You're really welcome to this recording of a short webinar which will support you to develop a results framework for your development education or your global citizenship education project. It's aimed specifically at organisations who are planning to apply to Irish Aid to the Global Citizenship Education Grants Round, the deadline for which is coming up in early December 2024. My name is Elaine Mahan and I work in IDEA, the Irish Development Education Association. So we are an association of actors in development and global citizenship education in Ireland. We are not involved in managing the grants round, but our role is really to support anyone who wishes to apply for a grant from Irish Aid for their global citizenship education work to do so. And a very important part of that application process is the results framework. But IDEA is not involved in setting the criteria for the grants or indeed in evaluating or assessing any of the appraisals. So we do advise you always to look for the latest information from the Irish Aid website. And if you have any questions, of course, you can contact us in IDEA and we'll do our best to support you. And I'm also joined today by another familiar face, Susan.
Hi there. My name is Susan Galway, and I also used to work for the Irish Development Education Association. And I suppose I have a special love for results frameworks because I was in Elaine's role when they were first introduced into the development education grants process. So it was a steep learning curve for IDEA members and IDEA staff and for Irish Aid staff in getting them on board. And it's a great credit to all three parties that it's really embedded in the process now without too many tears from anyone most of the time. So today's workshop is all about maybe taking some of the fear away from this whole thing of results frameworks and just really getting to grips with some of the concepts underlying it. So we're not really dealing with specifics today, but just to get into some of the ideas so that you feel familiar with it when you start it. So I think Elaine's going to start.
Great, thanks, Susan. So the aims of today's workshop, as Susan says, it's really a kind of aimed at beginners. So for anyone applying to the Irish Aid GCE grants who have little or no prior experience with results frameworks, we're really advising that you watch this webinar in detail, and we'll explore what we mean by results-based thinking, which is really the approach used for results frameworks, and we'll provide a general introduction to those terms and concepts that are used. So things like goal, outcome, indicators, and so on. We'll go through those in detail. And by the end of this session, you should understand the basics of results-based thinking, and you should feel confident to start work on your results framework in time for this year's grants round. And this session is a prequel to the Improving Your Results Framework workshop. So we'll be hosting a workshop in real time in IDEA online on Tuesday, the 19th of November from 10 a.m. to 12 midday. So we'd advise anyone who's planning to attend that Improving Your Results Framework workshop to watch this webinar in advance, which will give you that basic introduction. And you can register on the IDEA website on our training and events page for that session. Okay, Susan, over to you.
So what do we mean when we say a results-based approach? And basically, it's very simple. It's about describing the change you wish to create. And the results framework is just the map where you show the journeys that you need to reach this change, just showing each step. And instead of focusing on the activities that your organization carries out, which was kind of the traditional way people used to apply for funding, would be they'd say, we want funding so that we can carry out this activity and that activity. Now the focus is on why you're doing it, what change is going to happen as the result of what you do. And that's really the most fundamental shift in thinking that you have to bear in mind when you're doing a results-based framework, is thinking about the changes that happen as a result of what you do. And this is a really, really simple results chain here, which is that your organization does something, you provide training, you write a resource, you do something like that. Your target group then gains new knowledge. And then after they gain that knowledge, then they change something about their practice or their behavior, and that leads to a change of their situation. And so that's really the very basic thinking. And if you can get that clear in your head, you're well on your way to having a good results framework. And the important thing there also is that there's a clear logic of intervention, that each step is a logical progression from the other. And that's why sometimes even a chain is a better way to start it than a table. So why? Why is the big question? Okay, now As I said in the little introduction, this was introduced into the sector by Irish Aid, more or less to keep it in line with Irish Aid funded projects overseas, which all used results framework. So it's a type of reporting that was originally used in development rather than development education. And there's some big benefits for the donor. And one of them is it allows the donor, in this case Irish Aid, to see the potential impact of a project. They can look at it and say, okay, this is going to make a difference. It also ensures accountability because, as we'll see later, your results framework links up with your budget and they can see, how every bit of your budget is going to add to some type of change. And then it enables them to tell a bigger story about the work that they found. And that's very important, say, within Irish Aid, where some people working in Irish Aid might not know much about development education. They'd be like, why don't we spend that money on more overseas aid? But enables them when they pull all the results frameworks together to say, look, this is the kind of change we created. So there are benefits for them. There are benefits for the applicant as well, in that you are forced, very early on to articulate the change that you seek to create, that you're not just doing an activity or writing a resource because you want to, but you really feel there's a need for it, that you know your context well, you know what your learners' needs are, and you're addressing them. And it also ensures that your project is underpinned by logic, that you can think, well, if I do this, then this should happen, and this should happen. And, of course, it's not always a one-way system. There's steps backwards, there's steps sideways, but that there is this inherent logic in it. And then once sometimes once we get our funding, we tend to throw the results framework away, or at least put it away until you have to report on it in a year's time. But it is actually very handy to help you stay on track once the project is underway. And IDEA has done some interventions on that in the past on kind of using it as a monitoring tool, which we really recommend. So there are benefits for it. But when we look at it, it's not a pretty sight. You kind of go through the application and all the questions you have to answer, and you think, oh, the annexes, they're not important. And then you see Annex A, and it can be quite intimidating. The best thing about it is you can get rid of some columns probably if you're not doing 3-year funding. So that makes it easier. So then here's some questions. The next slide has some questions that people often ask when they look at Annex A. Like, where do I start? Do I have to work through it in a certain order? How does this relate to the narrative form? What if I don't know what to put in the boxes? And then, you may have some questions all of your own. And when we were doing this workshop live, we'd ask people to put them in the chat box. Can you think of any questions, Elaine, that some people would ask, as a first looking at it that they've said?
Yeah, I think it's like, do I start with this or do I start with the narrative? And I think like what we've seen is it's sort of a dual parallel process where you might start to draft out your ideas for the goal or the planned activities, but then you have to go back and kind of flesh it out in the narrative. And the logic of doing that then helps you kind of refine the results framework. So it's a bit of a dual process, I think.
Yeah. And we would also always recommend, print that out and just make notes in it from the start. You don't have to get it all right, but just think, oh, I've got an idea for this and that, so that you'll go back to it. So today, we're not going to deal with the fine detail, the really granular detail of that results framework, but we're going to make sure that the keywords and concepts make sense to you, because that's the most important thing. And, feedback we've had from Irish Aid have been that sometimes people, put like really inappropriate data in columns because they don't understand what they're being asked for. So today, if we kind of understand the building blocks, we understand the goal, the outcomes, activities, indicators, baselines, and targets, then you're well on your way. And just to say, there's a toolkit available from IDEA, and we really recommend that you get that because the toolkit is completely based on the Irish Aid form, and it will really help you fill out each column for that. Okay, Elaine, do you want to talk about goals maybe?
Sure, thanks, Susan. And just before I move on about the Results Framework Toolkit, so it's almost ready. So the version that's on the website at the moment is for last year's grants rounds. It's almost identical, but we do always like to update it just with the most current forms because we footnote where you can find this information in the Irish Aid application form and in the guidelines. So as soon as that toolkit is ready, it will be online in the next few days, and it will also be shared with all IDEA members directly. For any questions, you can always contact me, elaine@ideaonline.ie. Okay, so let's take a look at the overall project goal. So this is what the Irish Aid application form defines your goal as. So it's the high-level statement that provides the overall context for what the project is trying to achieve. So that's the wording directly from the Irish Aid documentation. It's not about specific measurable achievements, but it's a broad brushstroke picture of the success to which you aspire. So it's really the overall vision almost of the work that you're trying to do, and the activities that you're planning to do and the results that they'll hopefully have will contribute to this overall project goal. But it mightn't all be within, I suppose, your sphere of direct responsibility or influence as well. You may already have a particular goal or wording that you can use for your goal. For example, if you look into the strategic plan for your organization, there might be wording there that you can use about the vision that you have for your organization and for your development education work generally. And it might be helpful to think of your goal as your title for your project. So really as a kind of overarching statement that you're hoping to work towards. And then we'll break down, I suppose, how the different aspects of your project will contribute to that overall project goal or vision that you have. A really helpful place to start is the Irish Aid strategy. So the Irish Aid strategy for global citizenship education is available on their website. They've just recently been carrying out a midterm review of that strategy, but it runs up to the end of 2025. And the overall goal for the Irish Aid strategy is a really useful place, I suppose, to look to start to define the goal for your particular project or intervention. So the goal in the Irish Aid strategy is that people in Ireland have access to quality, lifelong global citizenship education, enabling them to become active global citizens committed to a fairer and more sustainable future for all. So I'm sure even if you were to break that down word by word, you'd see some terminology and some language that you could use to articulate the goal for your specific project for the GCE grants. And just even take a moment now as you're listening to this webinar, just to think, are there 2 or 3 keywords there that really relate to your project and what you're trying to achieve in your planned proposal? And then how might you use those specific words to articulate your goals? So I remember people, sometimes they focus on the word lifelong education, depending on the target group that you're working with, that you're committed to kind of a better future, so a fairer and more sustainable future for people, and maybe it could be around also increasing access to different groups of learners through your project to global citizenship education. So just take 2 or 3 keywords from that goal and see how they might relate, or they might help you to articulate your goal for your project in particular. And then we just give a sample goal here. This is just, in a youth work setting, so in a non-formal education setting. And the goal that we've just articulated here as an example is that through global citizenship education, young people are connected to local and global issues that impact their lives and are creating positive change through informed actions. So again, you can see that, the goal is situated in a broader vision for global citizenship education. It's not going into the detail of who the target group are. It's young people, but it doesn't say, their age group or where they are. It's still quite broad brushstrokes. You don't have to name the issues that they're going to be working on or the positive change, I suppose, that they're seeking to achieve, but it's a very general statement that then each of the outcome activities, indicators, and so on can connect back into. So it needs to be general enough that it's applicable to a variety of activities and outcomes. And we'll go through that in more detail. Okay, Susan, over to you for the outcomes.
Thanks for that. Yeah, that's really, really good advice, Elaine. And I think it's great to think of it as kind of the title for your piece, because it's just letting Irish Aid or whoever's looking at it to say, okay, this is where they work. This is their sphere of work. And I wouldn't try to fuss a lot over terminology like at the beginning. Just write down a few keywords and then maybe tweak it at the end. Just get it there. Okay, so outcomes are really, really important in your results framework. They have to be right or you're going to go astray. So outcomes are, according to the Irish Aid application, and we probably should say that just as a little warning that not these, if you've worked maybe for another organization, they may do results frameworks differently. They may use the same words in a different way. But we're not saying this is the best way, but we're working with the Irish Aid application. We're using their definitions. So don't worry if you have a different word for it in your mind. Just make sure you have Irish Aid's view in mind when you're writing it. So according to Irish Aid, outcomes are the benefits or changes which you expect to happen as a result of your work and which will ensure that you're making progress towards your goal. So if your goal is your big picture, like your ideal picture of a good world where everything is happening, what are the small changes that are happening here and here and here in order to ensure that the bigger change takes place? And I think we have Alistair to thank for this big question, which is the important question when you're doing a results framework, which is who is doing what differently? That is what your outcome has to be about. And then the minor question under this is how, when, and where are they doing it? But your outcomes are all about that. And if we go back to, say, the youth work example, in order for that goal to take place, who is doing what differently? What is different about the scene? And it has to be focused on the people you work with. And, that is tricky to think about it. So here's some little tips to do it, to remember that outcomes happen at different levels. So sometimes a learner will change, sometimes an educator or a leader will change, sometimes there'll be a policy change. So outcomes aren't all the same. And they also don't happen just suddenly. People aren't disempowered and suddenly become empowered. There's a small change that happens. And so that's why we talk about short, medium, and long-term outcomes. And I suppose a big question that you'll probably do in the results frameworks for improvers workshop is to think about what kind of outcomes are appropriate for a 1 to 3 year project. And it's generally like if it's a 1 year project, be very careful about long-term outcomes because, it takes a while to get a project running and then you've got to measure everything. 12 months is fairly quick. If you've got a 2 or 3 year project, you might have some. So we'll talk more about that in the other workshop, but just to realize that there's different time spans for outcomes. And then also to realize that some outcomes are visible and quantifiable. You can count if you are trying to get people to enroll in a competition. Well, that's really easy. You can just count how many entries you have. Other ones are much more difficult to describe. And these ones that are all about attitudinal change or about confidence levels, they are trickier to do, but we feel, and this is something I suppose that went on a lot in the dialogue between IDEA and Irish Aid, was us trying to say to them that educational change isn't always tangible and that we have to talk about, people's confidence to take things, people's ability to, feel they can teach certain topics, that those are outcomes as well. So if you just, the best way to approach outcomes is to think about your big picture of success. Write down some outcomes that you think will happen, and maybe you've already been doing these things and you see them happening. And then just look at them on a piece of paper together and say, well, look, if this happens and this happens and this happens, does that mean I'm making good progress towards my goal? Or is there a missing piece? Is there something like, okay, I've talked about how teachers understand something, I've talked about learners, but gosh, there's nothing about the education system. There's nothing about, change at school level. Do I need to have some outcome around that? So just to see, is there a missing piece? Because really, if all your outcomes are on track, you should be making some progress towards your goal. Like you're not going to achieve your goal, but because it's aspirational in nature, but just are you making progress towards it? Okay, so going back to this fictional youth work project that Elaine talked about the goal, which was very broad brushstroke. So now we've said, okay, let's break that down. And if we want young people to do this, what are some of the things that have to happen in order to make progress towards the goal? So one outcome that nearly all projects that are seeking Irish Aid funding will have an outcome like this, is that leaders, teachers, whoever are the people working with the young people or the adults, that they would have knowledge, skills, and confidence to bring GCE into their youth work practice. So that is a very simple outcome. And I would call that a short-term outcome because that should happen fairly soon after you complete your intervention, which might be a workshop, it might be a resource, that at the end of it, you could survey the youth workers and say, well, do you now think you could bring some GC into your youth work? They might say, well, I'm not really ready yet, but, I'm on the path. and you might be able to check in on them in a few months' time. But it's not a medium or long-term outcome because the target group are the young people. And so far, we haven't really got to the young people. We're still focusing on the people who are going to work with them. So a medium or long-term outcome would be further down the line on that. How do you feel about that, Elaine?
Yeah, and I like this outcome also because it is short term, but you can also measure it kind of continuously throughout the project. Like if you do have a 2 or 3 year project, you might have the same group of youth workers who you continue to work with, in which case you can kind of track their progress, their understanding or their skills or their confidence over
Yeah.
time. Or similarly, if you have a new cohort of youth workers who you start to work with next year, this outcome will still be applicable, even though it's with a new group. You'll be starting kind of from a baseline, a zero, really starting from zero, because it will be a new group. So I think it's flexible enough also in terms of time, whether the project is 1, 2, or 3 years.
Absolutely. And an important thing about having an outcome like this is it helps you get into this results thinking space, because even though can be measured nearly immediately after you deliver your intervention, the focus is not on you delivering the workshops. It's not saying we deliver an excellent workshop that is really using the best resources. No, it's about the change that's happened because you've delivered the workshop. So even immediately after you finish your delivery, you're not thinking about you anymore. You're thinking about how you're creating the change that you wish to see. So it's really important. There's the tiniest gap between you deliver the workshop and youth workers have the knowledge, skills, and confidence, but it's a crucial gap for outcomes, that you're thinking about the change in them. So that's why I think we put that one there.
That's a good
Yeah.
test for your outcome. If you can answer the question, who is doing what differently as a result of your intervention, then it's an outcome. It's not about we delivered a training course, as Susan said.
That is, if you take one sentence away from this workshop, it's that. And thank you, Alistair Collins of DP Evaluation, who gave us that question in IDEA years ago.
Yeah, and we still use that question all the time for our own results framework in IDEA as well. So it's a really, really helpful mantra to bear in mind. So now we're going to look at activities, which are a lot more straightforward. So this is also a nice, and often people have an activity in mind. Usually when you have a project idea, you're already thinking about the activities you want to do. I don't think we're always looking straight to the goal or the outcome, but the activities is something that maybe you're passionate about, or you want to, a skill or an experience that you want to expose people to as part of their, education or lifelong journey. So the activities, very simply, are what you are going to do. So it takes back that kind of the emphasis of the activity of you as the learning, the education provider, or who, if you deliver a training course or you produce a resource, for instance. So it's really about what you, the people who are being funded to deliver this project, are going to do in order to achieve those outcomes that we looked at previously. And it's really important to make sure that logic is there. So will this activity help to achieve our outcomes? So thinking back to your outcomes, whether they're short, medium, or long term. Also looking back to the outcomes, who is doing what differently, who is the who? So is it the youth workers? Is it a school or an institution? Is it a centre? Is it a local county council? Like, where is that happening? Because the activities need to address those different sphere as well. The activities can't all be focused on the youth workers if you're also hoping to have change in your outcomes at different levels. They need to be within your sphere of control. So you need to be able to stand over and guarantee that you'll be able to deliver this activity, barring some sort of natural or unforeseen issue or disaster, or something like COVID-19. None of us saw that coming, so that's obviously beyond your sphere of control. But you need to be, the activities that you select need to be activities that you in the organization that's receiving funding for the grant can actually do or can contract somebody to do. Maybe you'll bring in an outdoor educator or a facilitator who has a specific skill, but they need to be within your sphere of control. And they also need to link to the project budget. So that's Annex B to the application form. And this is a really good reminder, because the activities are transposed exactly as they're described, and as they're divided in the results framework into the actual table of the project budget. So it's really important that they're kind of quantifiable and that they're things that you can easily put different costs against when you go to use to complete the project budget in Annex B. And in the Irish Aid results framework and in the application form, they're labeled as outputs/activities. So again, this goes back to the kind of different wording or different terminology that Susan referred to that different organizations and different donors can use. But for now, we are, for the purposes of the doing the application for the GCE grants, we're thinking of them as activities, just very simply. So that's quite important. We're looking back at the table, and now we're focusing on activities. So we're building on the goal and the outcomes that we've used in our previous examples. And the activities that we have here, so we have 3 different activities. One is to deliver a global youth work blended learning program. So some sort of training or educational experience that will support the educators to deliver global youth work through a mixture of online and in-person sessions. The second one then is to produce a resource for leaders. So maybe some sort of training manual or a toolkit or a resource pack that the leaders, the youth work leaders can go on to use with their, in their own learning, and then also giving them ideas, resources, materials for their work with young people. And then the third activity we have is to set up a peer support system. So kind of cultivating some sort of a community of practice, with other youth workers where they can share and exchange their experiences, maybe with somebody, some more experienced youth workers helping the newer people who are newer to global youth work, for instance. So 3 distinct activities: a learning program, a resource, and that kind of peer support or buddy system. And a really important kind of mantra, I suppose, is to always use an action verb to describe your activities. So you can see the action words there, the verbs that we've used are deliver, produce, and set up. And if you're thinking who is doing the delivery, the production, and the setting up, it's you as the organization that's funded to do this project. So again, it's within your sphere of control, and that's really important as well.
Just to keep this whole logic thread going, it's always useful when you look at the activities to just read back and try to make the connection to the outcome and say, gosh, if I deliver these programs, if I produce a resource and I set up a peer support system, gosh, is that going to help ensure that I'm creating the change that I want to create, which is that youth workers have knowledge, skills, and confidence? And sometimes you think, okay, well, maybe they have the skills, but what about confidence? And that's where you say, oh yeah, no, the peer support system should give them that. So to just keep working on those logical links between the different columns. But that's really useful.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely. Okay, Susan, back to you then for indicators.
Now indicators, they're the worst bit. Indicators are the worst bit. And people get really tangled up about indicators. But really, an indicator is just a sign or a symptom of the change that you want. And the little thermometer logo there is there because it's just something that we use quite often, like any of us who might have a sick child at home. What's the first thing you do when they're not feeling well? Well, you tend to take their temperature. And finding out their temperature doesn't actually prove anything, but it gives you an indication. You're like, they've got a high fever, there might be something wrong. Or, so it's just looking for those little signs. That's all we're trying to do with an indicator. It's not a proof. I think sometimes people think like the indicator is going to prove that our program is good. But this is more just how we think we'll stay on track in our journey towards our goal. And that's the important thing, is to get the clearest and most understandable and most meaningful signs that we're on track. And that's what we're trying to do. And what you really have to do is to be a detective. You've got to think, how will I be able to tell if I'm making progress towards the change I want to have? And like, what will I see or hear? What will other people notice that will show that change has occurred? So it is being a detective. It's saying, like, what's different? How is the youth work scene a little bit different because of my program? What's happening? Do I see more people taking on this, that, and the other? So that's how you start. And I think we often do a lot of intuitive indicators. We all know if we've delivered a session, we all know if it was useful or if people got it, because we get feedback from it and we see our people engaged and interested. So it's just about really drilling down and saying, well, how can I measure that? And they do need to be SMART, which is, an acronym I'm sure you all know, that they need to be specific, they need to be measurable, they need to be achievable, they need to be relevant, and they need to be time bound. And the more specific you can be with your indicators, the easier job you'll have collecting the data you need for them and putting it into your results framework at reporting time. Because if they're very woolly, you won't know how you've achieved them. You won't know whether that's happened. So you really need to have them be that, and that will make your job easier. And then something we'll talk about in the, well, not we, Elaine is doing the results frameworks for improvers workshop, is a mixture of quantitative and qualitative, because ideally you really want both. You know, there's the kind of maxim, no number without a story, no story without a number. You want to flesh it out to give a picture of the change that you're creating. Okay, yeah, and maybe Elaine and I could talk about some of these quotes, because I think they're ones that are really worth thinking about when you're trying to draft your indicators. And the first one is, I often rely on an intuitive sense of whether a project is going well or not. And that's something we heard a lot from people when RFs were first introduced into DevEd. They'd be like, we don't want to measure it with indicators. We know if it's going well. But like what I would say is definitely think about that intuitive sense and then think, how can I manifest that in something that I can write down and can measure in some way? So don't throw your intuition out the window just because you're doing a results framework, but think, what does that actually look like? What do you think about that, Elaine? Have you noticed anything there?
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think as an educator that you do have a sense of intuition and you have a sense of something that's going well or not. It's definitely important. But I suppose it's only one perspective, and it's really important that you get different perspectives on whether or not something is working. So it can be from the learners themselves or from the ultimate target group, maybe the young people in the example we have, or other people in the organization who'll pick up on different messages maybe about the project. So I think intuition is useful, but you can't limit yourself to that. I think you do need to expose yourself to a wide variety of opinions and perspectives on whether or not what you're doing is working, and sometimes as educators we can get stuck into like our comfort zone of what we always do. So it is good to be challenged and to critically reflect on your own practice as well, and to invite those different perspectives, through the indicators that you've chosen and how they link to the
Yeah,
results that you're hoping to achieve.
absolutely. And then like people, well, in Ireland, we tend to be polite. And if we get a survey after a workshop, we say, oh, yeah, it's great stuff. I can use
Mm.
it all the time. My confidence has gone from 0 to 5 in half an hour. And but then you actually have to drill down and say, well, okay, if their confidence has improved, what signs can I look for? What changes have happened that I can record that will show that it has worked? Quote there, which is that sometimes you notice a gap between what we as an organization are hoping to achieve with a project and what the target group wants from it. And that's
Mm.
really important, because sometimes, like if you have a good relationship with someone in your target group, it's really a good idea to show your indicators, draft indicators to them, because they might say like, oh yeah, that's a really good indicator. That's what we're hoping will happen too. But sometimes they might say, well, that's not actually important to us. We don't really care about that. So it helps you make sure that what you're offering is understood by your target group as something that's meaningful to them. And sometimes by
Mm.
having that conversation around indicators, you actually manage to tweak the project so it becomes much more effective to them by having that conversation around the change that they hope to achieve from participating with you.
Absolutely. And even though like it's hard writing an application because we all know the pressures of maybe delivering a previous project and then you're trying to work on this one as well. But like it's better to have this conversation before you do the application than to have it at the end when you're going back and you're trying to assess the results of the project. You're asking questions, you're using the indicators that you created, and realizing then that there's a gap is a lot trickier than realizing before you've put the application in. So I'd really encourage you to take time to do that and to understand the needs of the target group. It also will really contribute to the narrative of your project in terms of the rationale for the project. What's your understanding of what your target group wants to achieve as well. It will all be useful information, for the rest of the application form as well.
And you're much more likely to get the data you need if it's a meaningful
Mm.
indicator. Because the target group you're working with, if you're tracking progress that they feel some ownership with and they feel is relevant to their needs, they're going to be very forthcoming with it, the data that they need. But if you're just asking them random questions, and I think we've all been at the receiving end of that, where we participate in something and then we get this kind of survey or something afterwards that seems to be talking about things that really weren't in our mind at all when we were participants, then you don't really get that rich data. So it's worth it because, you can also collect the data as part of the project if it's something meaningful. We tend to value what we measure. And that's like there, maybe as a little word of warning, in that if you indicator set out that you're going to measure something, make sure that it is actually important to you. If you make an indicator that's measuring something that you don't actually think is important, and then you're way below target, the funder has every right to say, well, look, why didn't you reach your target? And you can't really say at that stage, well, it doesn't really matter because you chose it as an indicator. So make sure, that what you do decide to measure is worth it for you, worth it for your target group, because it will guide your project to some degree, especially if you're doing good practice in RF reporting and looking at your RF quarterly and seeing, are you making progress? Because if you're not, you say, oh gosh, next quarter, we're really going to need to focus on this. So make sure it's something that's important. And then just to say, indicators are really difficult and nobody gets them right first go. It's always a question of you write something and then you tweak it. And in the toolkit, that's the longest section of the toolkit. So we really recommend you look at that. There's a little acronym called the AIMS acronym that will help you maybe decide which, because you don't want too many indicators, because think of the burden of reporting. If you put something in as your indicator, you're going to have to track it. So you want to have a relatively short list of indicators. And so you really want to pick the best ones. And if you have too many, you'll just be spending all your time collecting data and no time actually doing your project work. But they are difficult. There's no point in pretending otherwise. So in the improvers workshop, there'll be a lot more drilling down into them. And any of you who've done RF in previous years will be encouraged to bring some of your indicators where you might look and say, like, did this one serve us well? Would we need to tweak it in some way, and maybe share with other people?
Great, thanks, Susan. So yeah, a thought occurred to me around the baseline, and then I thought actually that's going to come up now. But a good way to test your indicators even before you start your project is to see, will they help you to assess the baseline? Like, where are people at the moment? What is the level of knowledge or understanding, of a particular issue or global citizenship or global youth work more generally? So it can be a good way to sort of test them. So the baseline is where you are now or where the learners are now, where the target group are now. So trying to assess the levels that we mentioned there before the project starts. Now, sometimes you have those from a previous project. Sometimes maybe your project is a continuation of a previous project, and the new proposal or the new application is working with the same target group, and in which case your baseline can be where they finished last year, let's say. But sometimes you're working with a brand new target group. And in that case, your baseline needs to reset to 0. So if your project is targeting transition year students, and every year there's going to be a new cohort of transition year students, the baseline will reset to kind of 0. So you just need to explain that. You can put a footnote into your results framework, or you can put it into the narrative. So just being very clear. Sometimes it's really hard to find the baseline. So sometimes you can use like a proxy baseline where you've gotten it from a similar project or a similar organization who's worked with your target group. Or sometimes it might be like a national statistic from the census or something, or, a statistic that you have about the local or the geographical area that you're in. So there's a bit of information about how to find your baseline in the toolkit. So we'd encourage you just, to think about that carefully, because you do want to show progress from your baseline. And again, it has to be something that you have control over. So the target that you set then is where you hope to be next year. So the baseline, target and result all need to be kind of, coherent and logical, and they all need to be connected, because your target, your baseline, I suppose, needs to be something that you can compare to the target, and vice versa. You need to be able to compare your target from your baseline. So they need to be comparable. So using similar language in them, whether it's a percentage of an increase of something, or a percentage, in confidence, or a number of people that you've reached, the baseline and target need to be, similar and coherent. And then the result, you leave that blank, but I suppose in your mind, you are imagining, is the target realistic? Let's say you want to reach 10 youth centres in your global youth work project. Is that target realistic? Or when you think about writing your result in your report next year, do you think actually 10 is all of them? It's going to be really hard to reach everyone. Why don't we say 5, or why don't we say 6 in our target? So it will help you to refine your target if you can be realistic. And your baseline would be how many youth centres are doing global youth work at the moment. It could be 1 or it could be 0 or whatever. So, showing coherence between those 3, even though the results are left blank, is really important, and making sure it's actually something that you can measure and that you can find the data on, either by asking your target group and your learners or, elsewhere.
I completely agree with everything Elaine said, but just a couple of points about baseline. One of the most common questions I think we're asked is, we don't have a baseline, will I leave it blank? And I would say definitely do not leave it blank, because a lot of the results framework is a confidence piece. It's showing the donor, in this case Irish Aid, that you know your target group, you know your context, you are a good bet for funding. And if you say, I don't know the baseline, it's more or less saying, like, I don't know anything about the sphere where I'm working. So come up with, you can say no specific baseline exists. However, we ran a similar program last year and reached X number of people, or however, another organization ran a program, in a different part of Ireland and they did this. So just, it's an opportunity for you to show that you've done your research. And I would never, ever, ever leave a baseline blank, because I think it's saying you don't know what's what. And then also, to repeat Elaine's word of warning, I think it's great to have that results blank column there to make you look at that target again and say, I'm not going to do that. Because, we all tend to be optimistic and say, oh, we'll do this and that. But when you think in 12 months' time, you're going to have to write a result in. And so be realistic. Don't worry. We all want to, make our work look really palatable to the funder and, good value for money. But if you way overestimate your target, it's just showing you don't know your context.
Yeah.
And, in your narrative, you can say, like, I'm working with adult learners, and this is a very difficult group for retention. Therefore, the target's very conservative compared to formal sector work. So, like, explain it, but definitely be in the driving seat for those targets and results, because it is your call. And you will only have yourself to blame if you're overly optimistic. Sorry for that word of warning, but I
No,
want to
you're
get
right.
that across to everyone.
And it reminded me as well that, like, especially for multi-year projects where you have, targets year on year, as Susan said, you will have to report each year. So there is a blank column for year 1 results, year 2 results, year 3 results. Don't be tempted to always just, increase the figures year on year. Go back and think about, who are the target group? As we said, is it a new cohort each year? Or actually, no, are we going to try and build, and have maybe 4 youth centres in year 1, 6 youth centres in year 2, and 7 or 8 in year 3, because retaining the people that you're working with is as hard as recruiting new members. So really, just, I suppose, be careful about the targets that you put in as well, and don't overpromise. It's much better to underpromise and overdeliver. But yeah. So just reiterating, I suppose, it's very much connected to the narrative part of the form, which is all about the rationale, why you're engaging with this particular target group, what their needs are, and what you can realistically achieve with them in the context of your project. The other kind of last word, I suppose, on the data. So it's basically, that's the final column, as far as I remember, on the right-hand side of the results framework. And it's all about how you're going to measure those indicators. So how are you going to know if you're actually making progress? You can put in great indicators, but if you don't have a way of actually gathering the data that will illustrate the indicators and the results based on your targets, you won't be able to paint a picture at the end of the project. So when we're talking about data, it's really gathering that evidence that's showing, that's illustrating the indicators. So the source of that data, so where are you going to get it from? Are you going to get it from the target group themselves? Are you going to get it from the managers in the youth centres who, have had youth workers attend your course? Are you going to have it from other people? So thinking about the source of your data is really important, and maybe trying to get different opinions, different perspectives on the work that you're doing. The tools are things like your surveys, of course, everybody will be familiar with. Maybe you have a pre-survey and a post-survey, before and after. You might have a focus group. You might have an interview. Maybe there's a couple of people that you would like to involve in the project, but they might be hard to get. So you might say, I'll do a quick 20-minute or 30-minute interview with them before and after the project. You might have an anecdotal evidence record where you're gathering information as you go, and we can go through those in more detail in the improvers in the Proving Your Results Framework workshop. But there's a variety of tools, so I'd say don't just use surveys, even though they're easy. And then also there's a reality check here as well, is like you don't want to spend the entire project gathering evidence and reporting on it. So making sure that it's, what you've said you're going to gather is proportionate to the size of the grant, to the amount of time you have, to the scale of the project in terms of people or places that you're working with, and just, again, being realistic about what you're going to have time to do. And something like a survey can be very straightforward because it's kind of managed virtually, in Google Forms or in SurveyMonkey, so it can give you the data in an easily accessible way. Something like an interview or a focus group takes longer because you need to transcribe the responses and analyze them. So, don't always go for the easiest tool, but at the same time, don't give yourself a headache in terms of having to gather huge quantities of data and then to analyze it as well. So try to keep it as simple as possible. It really needs to be proportionate to the size of your project and your grant. And don't rely on one tool. So if you just do a survey, that's risky because you mightn't get the responses that you hope for. So building in maybe 2 tools is a, as a minimum, is useful, just to make sure that you don't over rely on one particular source or one tool. Okay, Susan, back to you.
Okay. So really, what you need to do again and again as you draft your RF, and as both Elaine and I have said, it's not a question of starting in one column and working through that and going on to the next row. It's something that you kind of move around in a lot. The best RFs will tell a clear story of change, and they'll have logical connections across the columns so that an outsider can look at it and say, well, if we do this, then this will happen, then that will happen. And we know it will have happened because we're collecting data on this, and that is illustrating the change. So there just needs to be a clear logical thread going through horizontally across, that everything is talking about the same thing, that your activities will help you achieve your outcomes, that your outcomes can be measured by looking at the following indicators, and that the data that you need for the indicators is there in what you collected through your data collection tools. So it's not rocket science. It just needs to make sense. And I think in terms of the experience I've had with people's RFs and funding, is it's confidence. Like the donor is looking for someone who clearly knows what they're doing. They know their target group, they know their needs, they know the work that they can do, they know the limits of the work they can do. And they're proposing to do something to work towards this bigger goal, which again nests inside Irish Aid's even bigger goal, and that you are worth investing in. And I think it's that confidence. And if you don't check your RF, and if it's really sloppy, it doesn't look like you know how change happens. And I think that is the single. If you had to ask the assessors what is the most important thing, it's that people know how change happens and they know how to contribute to that change. So it isn't as bad as it looks. It really isn't. It should just tell a story, and it's never the full story. And you'll be talking in the improvers workshop about how you measure attitudinal change. Can you use perception-based indicators? The answer is yes, definitely use ones. Ask someone, have you changed? What's your confidence like? So it's really up to you what you put in it, but you want to have that overall picture of confidence, because in the end of the day, Irish Aid is accountable to the taxpayer, that the money that they spend on global citizenship education is creating the kinds of changes that they want. And we have to be realistic about what can be done with a small amount of money and a small amount of time. But we still do need to make a case that what we're doing is worth doing. And that's up to you to make that case. So, yeah, I hope you haven't been put off. results frameworks by this. And the toolkit, if you can look at the toolkit probably before the workshop, you'll have some questions. But I hope this has taken maybe some of the fear away from it, and to show that, like, the jargon, it's really just terms to tell a story of change. That's really all it is.
Great. So as Susan was saying, this webinar is really a prequel to our Improving Your Results Framework workshop. So that takes place on Tuesday, the 19th of November, from 10 a.m. to 12 midday. And in advance of that, if you can think about your goal, your intended outcomes, your activities, and how you might track progress, so those indicators we talked about. If you can start to draft those in advance, you're going to get a lot more out of that Improving Your Results Framework workshop. It will provide a real step-by-step examination, so we'll go into what we've covered today in more depth. It is free and it's open to all. You don't need to be an IDEA member to attend, but you have to register first, and it's on the IDEA website. You can sign up there. Please bring an indicator that you're working on, because we will break into small groups and we'll really, have a chance to share indicators with each other, and people maybe from similar organizations to you. So do bring an indicator that you're working on. And if you haven't already, you can download or print the Using Results-Based Approaches to GCE DE, a Practical Toolkit. So that's being updated at the moment for the 2025 Irish Grants Round, and it's available online. We didn't print them this year, but if you do want us to print one for you in the IDEA office and post it to you, we're also willing to do that, because we do realize it can be handy to have, in front of you and to sketch through it and really to use it like a handbook. So just contact us if you'd like to have a hard copy of it. Okay, so that's it from us. And just to say thank you, best of luck with your application, and please contact IDEA for any questions.
Absolutely, because it is so exciting to see, like, when we do these workshops, we forget about how exciting the projects are. Sometimes we get, really drilling down into the minutiae of the RF, and just to maybe even keep in your mind when you're working on it, like, this is not fascinating work doing an RF, but just think, this is going to give me money to do this project, which I know is really worthwhile. And sometimes when you see the RF and you can see that logical chain, can be very empowering to you as a GCE educator to say, like, I can make this happen. And so it is good like that. And we've come a long way with the RF since they were first introduced, haven't we?
Absolutely.
And, there was so much fear and anger about them when they first came in. And now we just see that they are just part of the application, and will help you do your job well, I think. So best of luck to all of you.
Right, thank you. Thanks, Susan, for joining us to do this webinar. And we look forward to hearing from the applicants in the process over the next few weeks.